It's 12:04, so we'll get started. Again, we're recording this webinar, so you'll be able to view this later. And you're welcome to turn off your camera, mute your video. Again, if you hit the triple caret drop down on your Zoom box and you hide non-video participants, you will not see all the video screens from all the planners that are here. And again, there's the chat function is open, so you're welcome to chat with your colleagues in planning across the state of North Carolina. You can enter questions into the Q&A box, and we'll take the questions at the end as the agenda there shows. So again, my name is Paul Moon. I'm a regional planner with Land of Sky Regional Council. I'm really excited to welcome you all to the All About ADUs webinar. This is a event of Land of Sky's COGWorks series. COGWorks is an initiative within Land of Sky Regional Council's Economic and Community Development Division. This initiative aims to provide learning, training, and networking opportunities around emerging issues in Western North Carolina. Land of Sky serves Madison, Buncombe, Henderson, and Transylvania counties in the western part of North Carolina. But given that the ADU issue is relevant across the state, we felt it was important to invite everyone. This initiative, the focus on ADUs grows out of a Land of Sky project called the WISH Collaborative. That's the Western North Carolina Initiative for Supportive Housing. Our effort aims to build the community's capacity for safe, accessible, affordable housing and transportation for individuals with high support needs. And we define those individuals specifically as older adults, adults with traumatic brain injury, and adults experiencing intellectual, physical, developmental disability. The reason the connection between this population and ADUs is that ADUs can serve to house caregivers for this population. It can also serve as a multi-generational household where parents can take care of their adult children, maybe living in a separate unit. And it can also support caregivers for older adults. And with that note, I'll pass it off to Richard Duncan. He is a great partner on the WISH Collaborative. Richard he is the executive director of the R.L. Mace Universal Design Institute. Richard has spent over 35 years in the field of architecture and product accessibility and universal design in residential, public, and transportation environments. His work includes a focus on affordable housing, transportation, accessibility, and community design for older households and people experiencing disability. And he likes to say that he is a planner with a small t. So with that, Richard, I will allow you to share your screen and get on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Paul. It's great to be here talking to you all. Let's see if I can get this going. All right, can people see this? Good to go. Let me do a little switching. Here we are.
I can see it, Richard.
Okay, and you can hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, off we go. So we really wish that this could be a webinar that was everything you needed to know about accessory dwellings. We know that even with 90 minutes, we'll only be able to hit the high points, and even at that, very fast. So we'll be talking fast. I know Scott will as well. And I'll kind of introduce the topic, and Scott will get into the real heavy lifting of all the details of planning issues that you all may be experiencing now, or may soon if you choose to kind of get more involved in what is really a national movement towards promoting and allowing more accessory dwellings around the country. So let's see if we can get our things to work. So I'll introduce what ADUs are very, very briefly, why we think they're useful for whom, what the benefits and beneficiaries are. And critically for our audience, and maybe for a lot of yours, the ADU features we think are really important for the kind of constituents that we hope may be able to take advantage of them. Universal design, and then some resources, of which there are happily a lot. So we'll be able to refer you to those, some of which I think Paul can provide to you and others of which we have, and a bunch of other organizations. So here we go. So you may be aware of what they are, and maybe be aware of what they're not as well. They are, small separate dwelling units on a property that already has a primary residence. And so that's in a nutshell what it is. They can take a whole variety of forms and styles, as you'll see. And we'll be showing you a lot of visuals about kind of what these things are rendered like. They've been around for hundreds of years in this country and around the world. Lately, less so on site. I think what we're talking about today is really helping along a renaissance in accessory dwellings in the United States, as well as kind of the companion renaissance in the larger category of kind of missing middle housing, which I think is what this kind of fits into nicely. They're have been known by lots of different names, from, backyard bungalows, granny flats, in-law suites, casitas. We're working in the Southwest, and that's one other name that's also applied to them. You may have your own that you've been experiencing. They're around 350 to 1,000 square feet. That's a little bit flexible. Much smaller than that, and you have a very hard time making units that are truly usable for older adults and a bunch of different folks with physical disabilities. And they're emphatically not tiny homes. Sometimes they're confused and conflated with tiny homes. Tiny homes are kind of a separate category of housing. Don't work well for a lot of the populations that we're talking about, and are really a separate topic for another time. But they're not tiny homes. Just rest assured with that. So who can live in these? Well, we spend a lot of time in what you might call the older adult space because of the demographic issues, which we'll talk about in a second. But certainly older adults, folks who are downsizing, folks who may need the caregiving assistance of family or others, maybe the resident inside of a accessory dwelling. And that drives a portion of the design considerations we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Caregivers is a possibility. It may be that individuals may continue to reside in the primary residence, and that the accessory dwelling is instead used for a person or two who might be able to provide some kind of caregiving or even property maintenance services. It could be a general purpose renter providing income to the occupants in their primary residence, allowing them to maintain their status in their home and in their neighborhood. And those could be a whole variety of people. It could be adult children. During COVID, we had a lot of that kind of issue come up over and over again, as we found adult children were in many cases coming back to the homestead. But that still happens. It happened before, and it'll be happening ongoing. Could be used for that or other family members. It could be used for offices, for example. Accessory dwellings, we found, really can change function over time with a lot of different purposes to which they can be put, depending upon the kind of state of the family dynamics. This is a chart that comes from the ABC's guide for ADUs, the ARP's published. We'll reference that later as well. Scott extracted this out. It's kind of useful way to look at one of the issues driving the need for this. It has to do with the size of houses and how much they've gone up over the past 40, 50, 60 years, from less than 1,000 to way more than 2,500. While at the same time, the household size has gone down from 3.8 in 1950 to 2.5. So it seems like we're building or have been living in houses that are larger than perhaps we need. This is certainly an argument for proliferating more accessory dwelling units, but also for smaller 1 and 2 bedroom houses of larger sizes. And it's important to note that 1 and 2 person households represent about 2/3 of all households in the United States. So that really speaks to an unmet demand for housing. And given the price of housing in so many communities, it really speaks to the need for dwellings like this. Looking at demographics, this is a big number, and it's gone up in the past 20, 30 years. So 1 in 4 adults have some kind of disabilities, and disabilities can cross across a whole range of issues. But I'd argue that there's a group that contributes more to that number than a growing population of older adults, all of which you've heard about before. Here's a little factoid that in 2034, we estimate that the number of older adults over the age of 65 will outnumber the number of children under 18 for the first time in the United States. And that's a significant benchmark. It just speaks to the changing demographics of the country, not all of which is bad, by the way. We're having kind of transition pains right now, but it kind of reflects what a healthy society might be looking like in the future. Other countries have surpassed this long ago. We're getting to it now. Another chart which kind of exemplifies what we're looking at now is the kind of demographic cohort chart on the left of 1960 and what it may be looking like in 2060. Some of it at the bottom is a little bit speculative, but the traditional kind of triangular pyramid of population has that lots of folks are born, we die frequently and regularly over time, and not very many of us live to be an older age. Well, happily, that's changing. It's a more rectangular, maybe trapezoidal shape in the future. And I think that's really what all healthy, progressive, modern societies would like the population to look like ultimately, is that we don't die as often. A lot more of us can live to older age. That's a good thing. We just have to kind of catch up with our housing in a number of ways. So demographics from a number of perspectives that kind of speaking to this. So a lot of us live in very typical homes and housing around the state and around the country, whether it's small, older wood frame, single story homes, or the ubiquitous brick ranch, which is by the thousands in North Carolina, maybe triplexes. We'd like to see more triplexes in the missing middle kind of array of homes. And certainly townhomes have become very popular. All of them, virtually all of them, were never designed to house older adults. Were never designed to house anyone with any significant mobility or other physical disability. And it's unfortunately where most of us live, or at least started out living. And that's really the presenting problem, this person housing mismatch, not just in size, not just in cost and affordability, but also in design. So as I say, we occupy a lot of space with older adults. And so that's one of our major areas of focus. And these households can be single person households. They might even be a 3-person household. In this case, you might have 3 people sharing a house for economic reasons or other reasons. And maybe that accessory dwelling might be lived in by a caregiver or a property maintenance person, who knows. You could have 2-person households. Again, all these folks are typically living in homes that don't work for them right now. And unfortunately, with these 2-person households, you have one older person helping another older person. Both of them are in perhaps not great shape, and bad things can happen as a result. And we have, multi-generational families. Maybe it's time for the younger set to be inviting mom or dad to come live with them. Maybe living in the house is not the best idea. Maybe living in an accessory dwelling might be better. And even if you're a group of beautiful models that have been hired for photography purposes, they're aging, right? And all of them at one time or another will experience these kinds of things. And these guys are also aging. If you don't instantly know who they are, I want you to contact me separately. I think we need to have a conversation about generational information, how that maybe is not transferred. We've lost one of them, unfortunately, a little while ago. Charlie passed away, but I'm not sure these guys will be living in ADUs. They may be having an ADU in their backyard for someone to help. But so that's for older adults, for people with disabilities, it certainly makes a difference. There's also this other fact is that, where our retail services, our frontline service providers living in our communities, but it's so expensive housing, accessory dwellings may be an answer to a part of that. I would submit to you that as an additional area. And of course, as an older adult, inevitably over time, earlier or later, we will acquire some kind of disabling conditions. We may be using devices like this, which really, as you can know from your own experience and maybe your own family, just don't work for most of the housing that people live in. Or you may be an adult of various ages, who has mobility issues of various kinds. Maybe you use a wheelchair. You might need some special features in your house, as this guy on the left might need. The design issues we'll be talking about today really more generic. We'll talk about customized features maybe another time. But anyway, all these folks can benefit from accessory dwellings, and maybe accessory dwellings designed in a way that's different from typical what they might have been some years ago. So going on this benefits and beneficiaries, affordability is certainly one of the key things. We know that in virtually all cases, accessory dwelling is going to be cheaper than a standard single family detached home in a particular community, given the house prices we see in most places. So we know that they're more affordable. Maybe it's 100 or 200,000, but that's almost always less than the average cost of housing in most places. Of course, the costs can vary. So we know that it's more affordable. We also know that it's not deeply affordable. In most cases, accessory dwellings aren't used as deeply affordable housing for the lowest income strata in our communities. And that's an issue that I think we should all work together on. How do we help households who may not have the same access to capital or to financing that others might have also had some of the same benefits that other households can have and accrue from building and using accessory dwellings. So certainly for older adults, as we mentioned, can live in them, and it's more affordable for them. Another thing for older adults is that by living in an accessory dwelling that is actually designed appropriately for them, they can live in and stay in for longer. They may delay or eliminate even moves to expensive care settings. Maybe delayed by 5 or 10 years, maybe eliminate that move altogether because they can stay there until the ends of their lives. And certainly all the others we mentioned, all the other possible renters. This is a big issue, I think, that shouldn't be overlooked. It really is affordable housing for a wide audience. In terms of money saving and affordability, reduced maintenance is an issue. These are largely newly renovated, newly built homes. They're much smaller. They don't require the same kind of maintenance as the homes that we may be living in now. A lot of older adults and other folks live in homes and housing that's among the oldest in any community. That's a problem. Keep it up. And as I said before, the income that derives from some of these ADUs may allow folks to remain in their primary residence, in their neighborhoods and communities for far longer. And winding it up, we know that social connections are another really big benefit, whether it's because of the relationship between the person residing in the accessory dwelling and the primary residence, or because they may be able to maintain themselves in their neighborhoods and communities for longer. All good stuff. We know that social connections is terrific. Social isolation, on the other hand, not so good. So all of this stuff has some very particular, we think, improved health outcomes as results, as well as public health outcomes. So improved physical and mental health, we think, are the outcomes that also accrue from living in accessory dwellings, particularly ones that are designed more appropriately. Let me just do a quick check here. All right. So they come in all shapes and sizes. Again, you may know this, but we're going to give you our cut on what's going to work best for the constituents that we're most concerned with. So a detached freestanding ADU, terrific. You can render it universally designed without many problems in most cases. An attached ADU as an addition of some kind, also, as long as you can get a step-free entrance into the dwelling, works very well. An ADU built on an off-grade level, not so good for an older adult or a person with a disability, may work well for some of the other populations we talked about. That's terrific. A renovated basement, if it's a walkout basement, walkout rollout basement, and gets you into a backyard where you can get somewhere, can work well for our populations of folks we're talking about. Over the garage, a popular option. Again, not so much for the residential purposes of our audience. Maybe for someone else who might be able to assist or provide rental income. And of course, garage conversions kind of by definition work well because they're already at grade. So that's the array of options though that we see. And here's an example of one. Nice little accessory dwelling. We think it might be fairly universally designed. It's got a couple of nice features I'll talk about in a second. It's also got a couple of features we can see right from the outset that are problematic. It's not the peace sign on the door either, by the way. But anyway, it's a good looking thing. It's got a step-free entrance. A couple issues I'll point out by way of going forward here. So again, approximately 350 to 1,000 square feet. From a universal design perspective, got to have a step-free entrance. There's not many doors in accessory dwellings, so 34 to 36 inch wide doors would be fine. It's got to, of course, have a usable bathroom. Got to have a kitchen that's usable. Laundry can be optional depending upon the size. And we think that in almost every case that people should plan for outdoor living space along with the actual heated space within an accessory dwelling, just because the size of the dwellings being small, and also the climate that we have here in North Carolina, we think works well from that perspective. So that's a very short kind of bullet point about the kind of features we like to see that we think you might be able to incentivize as well. So here's a nice little accessory dwelling. I said it has a step-free entrance. The problem with the step-free entrance is that it's a sloped entryway all the way up to the door. Some of the universal features that matter are kind of subtle. We really need to have a level platform at the doorway. Think of the woman we saw in the slide a few slides ago using a walker. Maybe she has balance issues, fumbling for her keys in her pocketbook, trying to open the door while she's sliding backwards down that very nice little pathway. Doesn't work so well. So you got to have a level platform. Also, whenever you have a level entrance to a house, in almost every case, you need to have some kind of roof covering, roof overhang. So either you recess the doorway into the housing structure itself, or you have some kind of a porch roof that extends over this to prevent water infiltration, snow or ice on occasion, in and around that doorway, which is going to be flush with the first floor of the house. So just things to be reminded about as you're moving forward. Very quickly, this is not an accessory dwelling, although it is an infill property that is in the Raleigh area that we had a hand in the design of. You've got a step-free entrance, a pathway going from where parking is up to the porch. The porch is level with the first floor. You've got a roof over that, so you have the weather protection. It does not have handrails on the stairs. We don't mind stairs, they're fine, just as long as you have them put handrails on them. This doesn't show them. And the pathway is firm, stable, and even, which means that you'll have fewer opportunities for slipping and tripping. So this is an accessory dwelling built as an addition in Durham. You might be able to see off to the side, this is actually an enclosed screen porch over there. The deck is level with the first floor. You don't see a ramp or a step-free entrance because it's an addition, and the primary residence, which is here, already had a ramp on it. And because they were relatives, right, this is a family member, they're able to use this to get into the house. They do have the space to add something here later on, if they needed to and wanted to, if, let's say, if the ownership or the residency of the primary residence changed hands. Another example from Durham, that's a garage conversion, a step-free entrance, very nice, no roof overhang there, which is somewhat a problem, but still, and again, a roof-covered, screened-in porch for that outdoor living space. Now, one of the reference documents we've got for you is, there are three of them from ARP. One of them is a catalog of plans, and this is among them. I'm not crazy about the renderings outside for reasons you'll be clear about in a second, but they do tie into very particular floor plans that I'm going to be showing you as we go through these slides going forward. So this is the smallest of the three examples, four examples that we'll show. It does have the outdoor living space, although pretty tiny. You don't see a ramp or a step-free entrance, which could have easily been rendered in this fake setup that they've created here. So it's really an omission, I think, that they have that they should correct in the second edition. So there's the stairs, no ramp. But this is the interior, small 350 square foot, really much more like a studio apartment. Here's your living space, your outdoor living space here. It's got an adequately sized bathroom with some features I will point out to you quickly, and a kitchen that looks to be pretty usable there. So you've got a curbless shower. They did add some grab bars. You don't have to or require them in your local municipality. Really what you want to require is blocking for later adding grab bars if and where people need them. And you've got, I think, crucially, an outswinging door. This is really an option, but it creates lots more space in what are generally the smallest spaces in the home. So outswinging doors and bathrooms is a great idea to provide maneuverability and convenience inside. This is slightly bigger. They did add a ramp. They could have graded it, but they didn't. 525 square feet. In this case, there was enough space for them to consider not even an over-under washer dryer, but a side-by-side washer dryer, which is terrific. You may not have that option, and there's other things you can do with respect to laundry to make it usable still going forward. Another one that we did, this is one where we actually used pocket doors to divide spaces up from one another. We also did a kitchen of a very particular design that has an under counter dishwasher, small size for a limited number of people. It has base cabinets that feature predominantly drawers. It has one lowered work surface for utility for folks You could have used the table here as well. You could also have used this alcove here for kind of pantry storage options, which I'll show you in a second, because we didn't show any wall cabinets here. For a lot of folks who are shorter or seated, the wall cabinet's a real problem. I tried to give an example of what it might look like without a wall cabinet in there. And here's just one of many options for pantry storage, which we like a lot because it gives this full height access for a lot of folks. And front controls on appliances make a big difference as well. So the largest of the styles that we'll be looking at is this one here. Here's the rampway on the left. Still your outdoor area, some covered area over the doorway, and large enough to put 2 impossibly tiny bedrooms in there. You can do it. It's a pretty tough thing to be doing, even in a space that small, but it is possible. This is really not family-sized units at all. In this case, they decided not to put a curbless shower, which is our #1 option for most folks, but they have a tub, and tubs are removable. You can convert a tub to a shower, which will work well for folks if you need to make that conversion. Some folks really like to have tubs, even though long-term they're really tough sell. So what we've got with the designs we're talking about, really applicable to all kinds of housing, but certainly to the accessory dwellings we're talking about here, are much higher function. They're livable, not just visitable. You may have heard some visitable come up in terms of design. We like more livable. They're highly marketable because when they're done right, they don't look weird. They don't look like grandma's house. It looks good, so that the EDU is really appealing to a wide range. When it comes time to customize for someone's functional changes, the costs are far, far less than they would be in a standard kind of dwelling, which is great. And they're really for everyone. While we know they work really, really well for folks with particular human performance characteristics, they're really usable by a broad cross-section of folks. There's nothing about those things, if you take the rampway particularly, that makes it odd. And just to understand, we're talking about universally designed homes. They're terrific for everybody, and they're always age-friendly, almost by definition. So if you can render these in your community, there's benefits we think that accrue on the community basis. So the continuity of residents and residences, right? So people can stay in their community, homes can be maintained. They have, as you probably know, this very kind of light touch on the overall fabric of the neighborhood, adding just a slight bit of more people in most neighborhoods, typically. If you're thinking about older adults, they do add to what we think is a very much more natural way of living, which is multi-generational neighborhoods. Everyone benefits from that. It's kind of generally a general wisdom that, you have older folks you can maintain in your neighborhoods. There's a public safety benefit because you have eyes on homes, eyes on the street that you might not have in other kind of less diverse neighborhood configurations. You're maintaining community character because you're not really changing much by the addition of a couple of accessory dwellings. As we pointed out, it's more affordable, not deeply affordable, it's certainly more affordable housing for a lot of folks. You can maintain the tax base, and we think even increase the tax base. Currently, there still are some issues with respect to appraising and that kind of the financing end of things, but we think those things will be ironed out, and clearly they'll be adding to the tax base and to the valuation of homes and housing over time. And we think there's even a benefit from a community's basis on services and budgets, because without doing anything to provide better, more affordable and accessible housing, we think there's a real negative hit on the local services and budgets. There's potential, whether it's from increased need for home delivered meals, increased reliance on emergency medical services because of people falling all the time, increased reliance on community hospitals and their emergency departments because of those falls, and on and on. We think that there's a real benefit to the communities on a bunch of different characteristics, including that. So where do you find out more? You find out more from our website, which has a ton of stuff in all these areas and categories. And more we conclude, we have a lot of videos of accessory dwellings and interviews with people who are living in them or folks who have chosen to create them. AARP has jumped hard with both feet on the accessory dwelling side, as well as the let's design homes and modify homes better for older adult side. So they've got their own really consumer-oriented guide called the Home Fit Guide. You can get that through our website as well. But they have these 3 documents that relate specifically to accessory dwellings. We think they're terrific because they really are broadly applicable, regardless of what reasons you're thinking about them for. So there's a quick kind of reference guide, which is called the ABCs. There's the much more detailed step-by-step guide that really takes you into the nuts and bolts of a lot of what's required. And we know what they know, which is that most of the folks who'll be considering these and developing these are what I would call mom and pop households, people whose biggest project has been a bathroom remodel. And so jumping into creating a whole new dwelling is an area of permitting and development and utilities and so on, and setbacks that just people mostly have no idea about. So this is really helpful to kind of give people a step-by-step guide into doing this. And I think most interesting to perhaps you all, they've got a publication that actually models state and local ordinances regarding accessory dwellings and what you might need to do or think about including as you want to make changes in your development ordinances over time. And this is at least a template. And again, for whatever reason you're approaching it, AARP sees the benefit for their constituents and is making this information available. They've got a ton more stuff on their website as well. And I know that Paul's going to make this slideshow available to folks afterwards, so you don't have to be hurriedly jotting this down. There's also an additional document I provided that has a lot of these links built into it. So you can, when he sends that out, you can just click on it and it'll take you where you want to go. So we've talked in my time about very briefly what accessory dwellings are and aren't, why we think they're important and for a whole variety of constituencies and for communities as well. So for families, for individuals, for communities, what some of the critical features are we think you need to be identifying for folks as they think about this and moving forward, and what the benefits are for particular communities, as well as a whole bunch of resources that may get you started. So this is me. We're the Universal Design Institute in Asheville, along with Scott and Paul, and we're to be found everywhere. Thank you for your attention. My time is over. I will stop sharing. And Scott, now it's up for you. This is the heavy iron is coming now. This is really what you've all been waiting for.
Yeah, Scott is the planner, capital P, in the Land of Sky Regional Council offices. We refer to this Scott as a planner. Scott is an urban planner with more than 15 years of experience in urban design, transportation, and land use planning in the public and private sectors. He's a strong affordable housing advocate. Scott serves on the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee for the city of Asheville and also Asheville's Missing Middle Housing Study Working Group. He has deep experience reviewing zoning and development ordinances in Western North Carolina communities, and he's able to identify barriers to affordable housing. Scott, thank you very much for presenting today.
Thank you for having me. Give me 1 second and I'm going to share my screen. Let's see.
And again, please feel free to put questions into the question and answer box. You can use the chat to chat with your colleagues in planning across North Carolina, and Scott will get started.
Okay, can everyone see and hear me, or at least Paul can quickly chime in on the visuals and the audio?
You sound good, and it looks great.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Just gonna set something up down here. Okay, so thank you all for your interest in this topic. It's definitely important from a whole range of issues that Paul and Richard have briefly discussed. And what I'm going to go over now are some general best practices that you can look for in zoning and development ordinances. And my goal is to be thought-provoking, but not controversial or contrarian. Anything that I'm presenting, you can honestly take or leave it. It's really just food for thought. I'm also going to note that I am not an attorney, but some things that I show you may be good information to discuss with your city or county attorneys. So everyone likes a top 10 list, and these are just a quick summary list of things that I have found across both APA, American Planning Association research, Strong Towns, accessorydwellings.org, AARP, and also some anecdotal observations from personal experience, having worked as a zoning administrator, also having done development review in a handful of states. I'm going to go through each of these on the following slides, but again, this is both a look at things as specific as dimensional standards, either lot sizes or area requirements for floor area ratios, and also taking a look at process, which is the very first slide. So the basic issue of whether an ADU is allowed via a discretionary process, and that can be either a special use permit in a quasi judicial setting or by a conditional zoning, which is a legislative process. Really, the best practice is to allow them by an administrative process or by right. That allows professional staff to consult clear and objective standards provided by state law and/or local zoning and development regulations. And the alternative oftentimes with the discretionary process is that it's introducing elements of cost plus time. For applicants, that's risk and uncertainty. For opponents, that's uncertainty. And it's also sometimes the tactic of delaying to deny a project. That's an actual phrase that I've had spoken to me from a land use attorney. Next big thing is parking. Common barrier or common requirement is one parking space required per ADU. Some alternative solutions, if you're looking for them, could be on-street parking if it's available. If parking is crowded, particularly in a more urban setting, you could look at something like a residential permit parking program. That's a classic example of managing a limited but shared common resource, i.e. on-street parking. And if you're a savvy ADU builder or owner, you're most likely going to build at least one space just to make the unit viable and marketable. A couple other alternatives to look at are considering maximum driveway widths, particularly here in the mountains or any place with significant topography. If you're going wider along a lot frontage versus deeper, that's actually got a lot of implications for cut and fill and just overall costs. If you're blessed with an older urban street grid with alleys, they can provide all kinds of great back of the house services, including driveway and parking access. Next is the issue of utility connection and metering requirements. These are not necessarily contained directly in zoning or development regulations, but as a local planning department, you're very often the first point of contact sharing this information with a potential applicant. So a couple of things to think through here. Gas and electric under state law are required to have individual meters, so no master metering. Water, private sub-metering within a unit, whether it's an attached or the principal dwelling going out to a detached unit is an option. Individual shutoff valves are required. And sewer can be a little bit more complicated. What you're seeing on screen here basically is kind of a quick summary. The main thing I'll have you look at is in the upper right, you'll see then and now. A significant change happened in state law in 2020. Essentially, the then illustration there, the P would be the principal or primary dwelling. The A would be the accessory dwelling. That's assuming it's detached. Previous to that, very often, 2 independent sewer laterals were required per building. That's a pretty significant cost. Under now, if you've got a principal and an accessory building detached, they can have one common shared line to the sewer main. And this is, it's the phrasing is deemed permitted rule for sewers shared by two residential structures. Again, kind of a very specific deep dive into NCDEQ rulemaking on sewer connections, but this slide does have a couple of links to both this diagram source and the state law. And just for a quick illustrative, here in Duncan County with our MSD, that's the Metropolitan Sewerage District. This is just a quick illustration of residential fees for new sewer connections. So just north of $4,000, that's a fairly significant cost once you're adding in all other things. And in a little bit, I'll give an example of an ADU that was required to have a separate sewer connection, and it was quite a bit more than that. Another area to look at across your ordinances are building square footage minimums. Some ordinances still contain language about requiring a minimum square footage for new buildings and particularly for ADUs. Under state law, this is not allowed for any building that is constructed under 1 and 2 family code. So essentially the residential code. So if you've got an ADU that's either modular or stick built, aside from building code, which I'll get to in a minute, that's the exceptions listed up there. You cannot set a minimum square footage for an ADU or any other building built under 1 and 2 family code per state law. 160D, for anyone that is not familiar with it, is the state planning enabling legislation for both cities and counties. Previously, they were city and county. I believe it was 160A, 153A, 2019 and 2020, they were combined. So if you've got any questions on these sources, 160D, it's the state planning and enabling legislation. Another follow-up on building square footage minimums is that the state building code actually has plenty of dimension and area minimums. This is just a quick glance across interior space dimensions, 7 feet in any direction, ceilings of 7'6", a room area, one primary room at 120, another at 70 square feet. And the image here is actually the second story of my house, which is pretty small floor plate in terms of 480 square feet. But just to give you a quick illustrative, spatially, that one room is 11 by 12 at 132 square feet. The other is 8 by 12 at 96. And just for reference, a queen size bed, if you're curious, is 33 square feet, 60 inches by 80 inches. Moving on to square footage maximums. Again, a common issue with ADU regulations is that some zoning regulations cap the ADU square footage relative to a principal dwelling, either on a percentage or a flat square footage. A flat square footage is admittedly somewhat easier to work from. It's, truth in advertising, what you see is what you get. The issue with percentages is that you can sometimes end up with what's jokingly called the small house penalty. Not to pick on Asheville, but the Asheville ordinance as it's currently written, I'm just illustrating that here, basically says the lesser of 800 square feet or 70% of a primary home for a detached ADU. You're allowed up to 1,000 square feet if it's an attached ADU. Basically, what you're seeing there though is that as the house potentially shrinks below 1,000 square feet, you are actually limited in the size of the ADU you can provide. Sorry, I'm going to silence that in a moment. Another example of instead of going lesser of, St. Paul, Minnesota, you'll see it down in the lower left, is actually considering a standard of 800 square feet or 75% of the principal dwelling. Thank you, Paul. Whichever is greater, that gives you the ability to essentially start at 800 square feet or move within that index of the house size. One other note I'll make is that Durham is actually currently considering 1,000 feet for a single story or 1,200 square feet for a 2-story or 1,200 square feet for a duplex ADU. So in essence, 3 homes potentially on one lot. That's part of the SCAD text amendments, which is the acronym for Simplifying Codes for Affordable Development. Next, moving on to floor area or lot coverage maximums. Very often you've got so many other elements of a code that are already effectively what you can build, either if you're looking at impervious surface maximums, which may still be indexed to stormwater requirements. These can sometimes impact, just good urban design and housing supply creation. As an alternative, you've got to remember that you do have height limits and setbacks, which are already dictating a buildable area for the principal dwelling. And really, ADUs are very often fitting in within a portion of that, perhaps with a reduced side or rear setback of, say, 5 or 6 feet. Tree and stormwater ordinance requirements also often create a default lot coverage maximum. Just if you've got X number of trees required or X amount of post-construction stormwater for quantity and quality required to be treated, that's got a spatial impact on a site. So again, this is just food for thought on things that you may already have that don't necessarily need to cumulatively add to other requirements like FAR or a lot coverage maximum. Next, in terms of looking at the actual lot, this is another example that I found from the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, which is currently conducting they're calling it a 1 to 4 unit housing study. It's essentially a narrowed missing middle housing study, and they're looking at more flexible options for lot configurations. Flag lots are pretty standard. They're looking at reverse flag lots and also back lots, which are sometimes called alley lots, particularly in older cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, what have you. Again, if you do have an alley system, it's a great resource in terms of both access and fitting in smaller units in different lot configurations. Next, moving on to aesthetic requirements. Some North Carolina ordinances actually still have aesthetic requirement language in their ordinances, and at least as of 2015, when this was originally developed, and as it's been updated in 160D, these are not allowed for units built under 1 and 2 family code, with some exceptions, which I'm noting here, primarily in historic districts, individual historic landmarks, or for considerations of either safety or floodplains. So in the upper right image there, that's an ADU that was built in the Montford Historic District here in Asheville. Very much fits in with the Foursquare American craftsman character of the neighborhood. Otherwise, similarly joking, if you want to build the Coors Light Quonset hut of your dreams, go to town. Moving on to owner occupancy requirements. This is another common code area that may be a barrier to the creation of both ADUs and other housing options. The state, through recent case law in 2008, and actually earlier in 1981, established that zoning ordinances must focus on use or form, but not ownership. The earlier case, if you want to look it up, and I'll bring it up in the notes, in 1981 was Graham Court Associates versus Town Council of Chapel Hill. But the most recent case was the City of Wilmington versus Hill in 2008, and that was focused on a owner occupancy requirement related to ADUs. Another note that I'll make here is that if you've got references to family, household, unrelated persons, that can, get potentially, legally dicey, and also local housing codes plus state building code already cover overcrowding concerns in a number of places. So if you're really trying to narrowly tailor either your zoning or development ordinance to use or form, not ownership, that's a good way to go. Finally, the issue of allowing short-term rentals as a permitted use in ADUs comes up all over the state, all over the country, particularly here in Western North Carolina. The Asheville area has just over 12 million visitors a year to the 500,000 people or so that live in our larger metro region. So it's a definite debate about should you allow them, when, where, and how. 2 points in AARP's Model State ADU Act argue for allowing short-term rentals. One, as a possible method of producing new ADUs, And secondly, in that they just simply create use and ownership options for the owners. Today's short-term rental may become tomorrow's long-term rental or a guest house for friends and family, what have you. This is also a potential compromise solution to the issue of banning whole home and unit short-term rentals. So again, food for thought, really just looking at that. One thing that I'll follow up with, looking at ADU growth in Portland, Oregon, I do note there on this slide that when the city officially allowed ADUs or officially allowed short-term rentals in ADUs, the number of permitted ADUs increased exponentially. That's not necessarily a direct correlation, but it's definitely, along with relaxed design and setback standards, helping a 140% increase between 2014 and 2016. Next, I'll move on to just a couple of specifics of a local ordinance that I think hits most of these basics pretty well. I looked at ordinances across the state between 10 different cities, and Raleigh, not just because it's the state capital, has a pretty solid ADU ordinance. They allow short-term rentals. They index their maximum square footage sizes to the lot sizes that they're on. So essentially, if you're over an acre or right about over an acre at 40,000 square feet, you can have up to 1,000 square feet max in an ADU. They allow 2 ADUs on a parcel that's in an identified frequent transit area. Raleigh is currently exploring bus rapid transit. Again, if you're in a smaller jurisdiction that doesn't have as robust a transit system, this may not be applicable to you, but it's a fairly common metric that's being used in a lot of larger metro areas. Currently, ownership of an ADU is not allowed to be transferred separate from its principal dwelling, and that poses a definite interesting question on the issue of ADU condo or townhouse ownership. This is technically legal under state real estate laws, so that's probably another presentation and another slide to discuss later, but something interesting to think on. They don't require parking for ADUs. They do require parking for short-term rentals, and they speak specifically to manufactured homes being allowed as ADUs. One thing that I will note here, just circling the square footage limits in red there, is that they are separate. They're separate standards for essentially stick-built construction versus manufactured homes. And it's really setting up somewhat of a double standard. A single wide, for example, can be smaller than a lot of stick-built construction. It's actually very often more comparable to a tiny house construction in terms of square footage. So if you're looking at manufactured homes being allowed as ADUs, which these days can take a number of different configurations, it's not just your standard single wide or double wide. It's something to consider in terms of just building equity and consistency for square footage limits. Again, taking a look at Raleigh, they've had pretty exponential increases in their numbers of ADUs that have been applied for and permits issued. Last, I'll give you a couple examples of ADUs here in the Asheville area. So the first one is in the Bent Creek area of southern unincorporated Duncan County. The main home that you can see in the back, I wave my mouse over, main home was built in the 70s. The ADU was built in 2022 at $190,000. The higher cost of that reflected the rolling topography and the landscaping that were put on this ADU. The electric was done as a separate meter. Fun fact, Duke Energy requires any building 50 feet or further away from an existing service to have a new meter and address. The water uses the existing dwellings line. The water provider would not allow a separate meter, and the sewer provider did require a new line to the ADU 100 feet at about $1,000. So definitely water, sewer can definitely be pricey on some units. Taking a look at another unit, this is actually my next door neighbor in West Asheville. It's an old neighborhood with a new house, and the ADU is actually, it's just shy of 500 square feet. I updated that in the bullets there. It's 480 square feet. It's a 1 bedroom, 1 bath, and it was built for just shy of $80,000. So certainly if you're doing something pre-built with a home, again, the house is up, ADU is down in the basement. You may see some cost savings just from the shared walls, shared systems. Again, kind of a quick rundown there: electric separate meter, water uses the primary dwellings, water and sewer, they have a shared line. So again, just to review, these are sort of a top 10 list of things to look at and consider in your ordinances, whether it's zoning or other development related ordinances related to ADUs. And as a last piece of information, somebody had asked about this from our attendee list. There was a question about 2 bills that are currently at the North Carolina legislature. House Bill 409 down there at the bottom, that's a regulation of accessory dwelling units, and Senate Bill 667, regulation of short-term rentals. If you're looking at the top there, it might happen question mark versus green already law. That's my quick color coding of this. So the House Bill 409 elements are reflected on those of either utility requirements and parking. Again, as I mentioned earlier, 160D already mentions square footage minimums and aesthetic requirements. And I make a note there on owner occupancy requirements on the case law from the city of Wilmington. And it's also, I guess, as a repeat or reminder measure included in House Bill 409. And with that, I'll be glad to take any questions or comments you all may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Scott. Well, since you talked about that Duke Power issue, I'll start with that question about Duke Power requiring a separate electric meter for each occupiable structure dwelling. You want to address that?
Yeah, well, it's I should say that was the 50-foot or more distance was what I learned from that ADU owner in Southern Buncombe County. Now, I should say I had done some research on that. Again, the state rule on master metering versus individual metering, but there may be an instance where if you're doing a conversion within an existing home, that may be an option for sharing. But I'm not an electric utility expert, but definitely just bringing up the issue of looking at that for any separate connection or whatnot. If anybody on the call is an electric utility expert, I'd gladly take any chime-in comments.
Yeah, we definitely have a great resource of planners on this call. So please feel free to raise your hand or come on screen or chime in with some answers. Richard.
Yeah, I've got two things I wanted to emphasize. One that I forgot about mentioning. We have all 3 of the ARP documents we talked about, so people can contact me directly if they don't want to be clicking around. They can send me an email at my email address, and I'll be happy to send it to them. The other thing is that I want to mention and remind folks is that while we emphasize in a lot of the work that we do, ADUs with a particular design, right, that are age-friendly, that are able to be lived in adequately by folks with a variety of ability levels. There are very few examples of decent floor plans of those. I've showed you just about the only ones that exist, that and a couple more that we did. So one of the ways that we're tackling that is we think that we're on the brink of coming to some agreement, working with the city of Raleigh this year to roll out a design competition for age-friendly, which of course means everybody friendly, age-friendly accessory dwelling design, much as they did a couple of years ago to create the collection of kind of pre-approved accessory dwelling plans that they've already got online that are available to folks now. And that's one of the reasons why I think Scott was showing this tremendous increase, where there's just more stuff out there that people can latch onto, because most of the developers of ADUs are very inexperienced development folks, mom and pop, right, who are doing this. So hopefully a year from now, Raleigh will be able to roll out another half dozen, perhaps, very nicely designed, age-friendly accessory dwelling plans for folks to grab onto, use, modify as they see fit. But the original plans, at least, have been pre-approved by the city planning department. So it eases a couple of the permitting steps in the development process that might otherwise not be in place. So you stand by for news on that going forward.
Richard, I want to, something that you touched on a little bit. Can you describe the difference between a tiny home and an ADU?
Yeah, well, I don't know tiny homes as well, only that they're tiny. And they're usually not on foundations. They're able to be picked up and moved around, but they're quite small. That's the primary characteristic that takes them out of the running from my perspective, is that they're less than 250 square feet. And people, I mean, for some populations of folks in some circumstances, you know, they're a terrific option, even more affordable, of course, than even an accessory dwelling. And they may not be really a full dwelling unit as it is, but you just can't accommodate. They don't accommodate easily step-free entrances, certainly storage, kitchen use, interior turning space, and bathrooms particularly. And bathrooms are one of the big differentiators in unit interiors between what's traditionally built, like a 5x8 bathroom, and in these tiny homes, the bathrooms are closets. We've looked hard. We've tried to find tiny homes that may have been successful nationally, and we haven't found one. So if you find one, let me know. But in general, they're regarded very differently, I think, by the building codes. Yes, I'll throw that to Scott. Yes.
So essentially, yeah, I mean, if you're doing stick built, that's, 1 and 2 family code. If it is there's the whole other issue of, tiny homes on wheels or whatnot. I mean, basically there's three basic building codes. You've got HUD label code, which is manufactured homes. You've got DOT, which is for RV or anything that's on wheels. And then you've got 1 and 2 family stick built. So, yeah.
Do you have anything else to add on that distinction between tiny home and ADU, Scott?
It's so often, I think, in the eye of the beholder. I mean, if you're working off of a hard square footage metric of, is it a micro unit? Is it a tiny home? Is it an ADU, depending on, if you're doing a size index to a lot or a house, it could be somewhere up to 1,000, 1,200 square feet. You can make an ADU or a tiny home as small as, 250, 300 square feet potentially. So, yeah, I mean, it's really, part of its nomenclature, part of its square footage.
Yeah, I've seen tiny homes that are 150 square feet. I mean, they're
right.
very small.
I'll take this question. A big issue with the increase in build for rent product types is the inability of residents to build generational wealth. While ADUs can help provide affordable housing stock, can they also help address the issue of building wealth?
I'll chime in on that. That's a great question. And the brief mention that I had about permitting or developing ADUs under either condo or townhouse ownership, and this is something that I looked at pretty quickly in North Carolina real estate law. Townhouse is a bit of a misnomer, at least in my mind. I'm usually thinking shared walls, Baltimore style row houses, but townhouse under North Carolina real estate law simply means, the freestanding unit, including the exterior of it and the land that's underneath it. Condo is just the internal contents, not including the land. So there's actually a state law called the Planned Community Act. I think it's chapter 47F. I'll see if I can throw it in the chat in a moment, but that has been used to develop freestanding homes on lots here in the Asheville area. I'm not aware of any specific instance of an ADU being developed as that yet, but just for quick reference, the city of Seattle updated their ADU regulations, I think in the last year or last handful of years, and 1/3 of all ADUs being built in the city are now being built under condo ownership, not for rent. So ostensibly, if you've got either condo or townhouse ownership of an ADU, that's definitely an ownership and wealth building opportunity.
And yeah, you told me what was the average price of those ADUs?
So Seattle being Seattle, the median home price is $1.2 million, and the median price of an ADU, I think, was somewhere around $700,000. So, both of those numbers are both very big, but if you've got a choice in a real estate market of 1.2 million versus 650 or 7, you might go with 650 or 7.
Yeah, so there's wealth building opportunities, but you probably have a lot of wealth to begin with, at least in Seattle. Yeah. Richard, anything to add on that?
Well, just the notion, I think that's great to point out that there are now increasingly alternative ownership modalities, not just fee simple, that can work for folks at far lower price points than single family detached housing. And just a reminder that, all housing is niche housing, right? Really, every kind of housing that's built is trying to appeal to a certain market. And if someone's able to rent for a period of time at a much more affordable rate than they might have had otherwise, that might perhaps allow some wealth accumulation that might be needed for some of the initial steps towards home ownership, maybe giving them time to seek out these other ownership opportunities.
Richard, I'll stay with you. What is the universal design opinion on relatively new walk-in tub options?
Walk-in tubs?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a real niche product, just like some houses are niche houses. Really benefiting, I think, a relatively narrow band of folks who can afford the hefty price tag of these things. They're advertised, I think, properly so as luxury items. I mean, $10,000 in many cases to get one of these things put in. The problem that we have with them is they tend to have a very narrow usage range, and so if you're a person, and I'm speaking generally, right? If you're a person who really has a great need, they can't step over the edge of their tub, right, to bathe adequately or safely, they're probably on a health trajectory. If they're older, particularly, that means that a lot of other things are going to be difficult, perhaps in the near future. So getting a tub with a door may be terrific for a year or 18 months. What happens then when entering and exiting become the issue? Will they require caregiving? So I don't think of them as a really general purpose, big thumbs up for a lot of folks. It is a challenging thing figuring out bathing options, tub with door, curbless shower. They tend to be kind of a vast difference between folks who will only do one versus only do the other.
Thank you, Richard. I see you entering in the chat about that question on impact fees. I just lost it in my screen. Do any local government exempt ADUs from impact fees or a reduced fee?
Yeah, I just made a brief comment on that. Specifically, one example that I had here in Asheville-Buncombe County is that Buncombe County Metropolitan Sewerage District has both a connection fee and I guess what I would categorize as a general facility charge fee. And a local builder that I was speaking to earlier this week noted that for attached ADUs already within an existing home, they waive that fee. So there is some increment of cost saving for an attached versus a detached unit. Otherwise, I'm not familiar with other, at least in North Carolina, other local governments that waive system development charges for ADUs. Very often, if you're looking at things related to utilities, it goes back to the issue of either the spacing or topography or gravity that you may be fighting for water or sewer, or base requirements. Somebody did mention, and yeah, I think it is a it's a state requirement, and certainly for Duke Energy, which is the predominant provider across the state. Some cities have municipal electrics. Generally, it's going to be on utilities for things like schools and other charges I'm not as familiar with.
There's a question, maybe a comment and a question. What we need are best practices to mitigate the risk of having ADUs turn into problematic rental homes, especially when owned by landlords who do not manage tenant behavior as well. Is that anything that you've researched, Scott?
I haven't particularly, but I think the general issue with any kind of rental housing, whether it's in a single family detached home or whatever else, is it's a basic issue of just good old fashioned code enforcement. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, but my quick thought on it is, regardless of the type of housing that it is, if it's rental or owner, that's ultimately the decision of the property owner. But in terms of absentee landlord or whatnot, I don't know. I've seen, definite arguments against owner occupancy requirements. At least in the sense of, the access to that housing, from a renter standpoint, but I would really assume that would be more of a, basic code enforcement issue. I don't know if Richard's got a thought on that.
I don't, mostly because I was answering one of the chat questions. I'm sorry.
That's okay. There's no mention of home occupation in ADUs. What is the wisdom on this issue, Scott?
Oh, that's a great question. So my neighbor's ADU that I showed in the slideshow, some people call it the purple house, the paint color is blackberry. There's actually a young couple that lives down there right now, and they both, as far as I understand from my neighbor who is the landlord, they both work from home. So laptops a go and all that. Also, I'll just quickly add that 2 previous tenants of that unit were both traveling nurses. So definitely, a whole range of options of housing for people in all kinds of occupations. But yeah, I think from a home occupation standpoint, or working from home, I suppose is one thing. Home occupation, if you've got a custom embroidery business or something else like that, I think most home occupation requirements could still apply to an ADU of either if you've got customers visiting, provide a parking space, or hours of operation, noise, smells, different things like that.
Going through the chat here, do you see many attached ADUs having access to the main home from the interior?
Richard, you want to? I chimed in on it briefly, just thinking about. Again, my neighbor's house is a perfect example of a multi-story, small footprint house where they don't have a shared stairwell or anything within the house, and I think partly from a either privacy or whatever consideration, but also it's a basic spatial planning consideration. If you've got a 480 square foot house footprint, and you've got a stairwell eating into that whole sidewall of your house, you're losing space. So at least in that instance, they have an exterior stairway down to the lower unit. I guess in a side-by-side, there's probably a lot more flexibility just up to the individual homeowner or designer. Richard, you got thoughts on that?
I think that what isn't one of the base level requirements is that the ADU has to have its own exterior access, correct? You can't access an ADU from only within the adjacent house. Is that correct? I think that is. So
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I think in AARP's definition, I think that qualifies, Richard, what you described.
yeah, so if I was building an attached ADU for my mom, I would make sure there was a communicating door between the two, but I think by code, we'd have to have an exterior access as well. That can change a lot of different places, but that's in the general rule that I go by.
Right, just from a life, health, safety standpoint.
Right.
This is definitely a policy question. I'm interested for your insights on this. People buy a home in a neighborhood expecting the neighborhood to remain similar over time without sudden changes, allowing short-term rentals and ADUs abruptly changes single-family home neighborhoods to effectively duplex and multiplex neighborhoods. Where is the policy addressing concern about this potential financial injury to existing homeowners while enriching others with rental income?
I mean, it's really, I think the question on, the question on, single family detached only versus anything else in a neighborhood is really a question of, it's, does a neighborhood change over time in the long term? And in terms of short-term rentals or ADUs, I think, so many neighbors, I should say so many older neighborhoods, that pattern is already there. In terms of a neighborhood that is more newly built, very oftentimes if something is newly built, it may have an HOA or covenants, which are already dictating either ownership or uses. So I guess the short answer is, if you're looking at I guess, a strong degree of control within a neighborhood, some type of non-governmental HOA or covenant system is probably the best option. Otherwise, in terms of a neighborhood changing over time, that's very often the nature of city neighborhoods. So I don't know if Richard's got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought I detected a note of a slippery slope in the question, that if you're allowing ADUs now, what about some more things later on? And I think the statistics I've heard is that in communities that have gone hard on this, it's something like one ADU for every, I don't know, 3 or 4 city blocks or something, or 3 or 4 neighborhoods. So even at its maximum expression, you don't get that many and that much of a concentration that you're really at risk at all of changing the character. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and Scott even mentioned this, Portland seems to be ground zero for ADUs. For people who love them, it's the best place in the world. For people who hate them, it's the best example of why you never want to go down that road. I would suggest you exempt Portland from a lot of your considerations, because it really is an extreme example that's unlikely to happen. But thirdly, there are lots of ways you can allow ADUs and by ordinance limit the length of stay without saying they have to be a 1 year. I mean, we've had working with Cincinnati now. They're talking about, well, no less than 15 days, or maybe it's a month, or maybe it's 6 weeks. Some way to let the affordable housing advocates feel like they've accomplished something towards providing this long-term rental opportunities. And at stays of that length, the thinking might be that, well, you're eliminating the weekend traveler or the week-long partier. You may be having the business person come in, and it still allows people to, that's the minimum, of course, allows people to rent it for longer periods of time as well.
This is a great question. What's a good method to ensure ADUs don't lead to increased congestion and on-street parking? Here, those are 2 concerns raised by neighbors in opposition to ADUs.
Sure. So, just an example, I mentioned residential permit parking. Especially if you're, either relying on just due to the age or the predominance of the built pattern in a given neighborhood, that can be a solution. It does generally require that your local, either city or county, have some semblance of a parking authority that would basically be issuing the permits and monitoring that. It might also be a matter of doing, just a neighborhood scale or a district scale parking study, looking at utilization. In terms of congestion, I guess, one person's congestion is not another person's congestion. But again, if you're trying to index it to either a larger parking study or a transportation study, if you're looking at, level of service at nearby intersections or things like that. I think also very often anybody that's done development review definitely knows that the fire department is involved in the shaping of cities and real estate. Oftentimes, if you're looking at things like a minimum of 20 foot of clear for fire service, or if you've got a hook and ladder that's minimum 26 feet of clear for outriggers and things like that. So I think it's definitely trying to take into consideration the amount of space, literal space that you have either on the street or on existing lots, and indexing it to what about the current parking situation, either numbers, utilization. You're trying to look at a residential permit parking program for either nights and weekends, things like that. Those are 2 quick examples that I can think of that I've seen in other places. But yeah, if you don't have robust transit or bicycle and pedestrian facilities nearby, it is a reality that you're going to have to think about parking.
Yeah, and of course, including parking on a particular piece of property tends to increase development costs, or increasing parking, and that's part of the issue is affordability. There are, of course, all these gradations. We see these things where you don't require additional parking if such circumstances are met, in terms of whether the accessory dwelling is taking over an existing parking space that's already on the property. So there's gradations of this. And I think that the materials that we've got that you can take a look at kind of explore some of those as well.
Scott, I don't mean to put you on the spot with this question. It came to me
No worries.
directly. What are your thoughts on the passing of Senate Bill 349? You're far more knowledgeable on this topic than I am, so interested for your insights.
So Senate Bill 349 was basically, I don't remember the exact wording of it. I think it was it was a bill at the North Carolina legislature that was proposed in 2021. And it was essentially, in some ways, a missing middle housing bill for North Carolina. It would have essentially legalized, I believe, ADUs, duplexes, and triplexes on most residential lots across the state. As it was written, I felt like it was, fairly straightforward and, had a lot of promise. It did not, it stalled out, but I think it's the general idea behind it has been modeled on other states that have successfully passed zoning reform at the state level, like California and Oregon, and actually just this week, Washington State. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to learn more about it, I'll put two links in the chat in just a moment. The Planned Community Act, which I mentioned earlier about condo townhouse ownership, and Senate Bill 349, which was more or less North Carolina's sort of first big pass at missing middle housing at the state level.
I can't recall whether we took this one on. Any suggestions for keeping the character of established neighborhoods? Did we address this one?
No. Yeah, I mean the basic, again, depending on what your definition of character is, it's like talking about what is good art, but in terms of aesthetic requirements, state law limits that on 1 and 2 family construction, but you still have the basic dimensional and height, mass, and bulk considerations of setbacks, height limits, step backs, even if you've got that's more for a general, multi-story building. But generally, if you're looking at a, glass and steel mod box in the backyard of a, craftsman bungalow, I think it's also an issue. Well, landscaping is another definite, element of a lot of zoning codes that's very often used in terms of either buffering or screening requirements. So those are just a couple of quick thoughts that I have that, elements of zoning ordinances that are outside of explicit aesthetic requirements for the actual building, but in terms of what you can see or not see, landscaping, screening, and again, just going back to basic, height, mass, and bulk requirements. Richard, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's covered. I mean, it's tough to enforce and develop aesthetic issues in residential areas outside of HOAs.
Well, we are coming up on time here. If anyone's got any last minute questions or anything they want to raise, please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. Otherwise, I will be sharing materials, the presentations from this webinar to all registrants, including the recording and some other links, and also a survey on how your jurisdiction deals with ADUs. It's very possible that we will offer a second webinar because there was a lot of interest, over 150 registrants for this. So we may pick up this conversation in the summer. Yes, Scott, I will leave it to you and Richard to close it out. It's been great to work with you on this.
Yeah, no, I was just going to briefly mention, I know I promised a moment ago to put 2 links in the chat. What I'll do, Paul, if it's okay with you, I will give you those so that you can send them directly to folks' email. I know oftentimes in a chat and Q&A format, links can get easily lost. So I will send those out shortly to Paul to share with you all.
Great. And I think Richard will share his favorite Rolling Stones song too.
You gave it away.
Well, thank you again for joining us. I hope that you all have a light afternoon, an easy Friday, and a great weekend. Thank you again. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Richard, for your.
Thank you all.